And so, we commit Malcolm Tyler to the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The dirt hit the top of the child-sized coffin as it slid into its final resting place. John just sat there, surrounded by family and friends, yet utterly alone. Malcolm had been 10, on the cusp of the age of reason. As John looked at the picture of his departed son, he could swear it was one of his own baby pictures. Malcolm had loved baseball, superheroes, Star Wars, and old video games. He had clung to his father's passions, and the two had always been close. As he watched the coffin slip into the earth, John felt the tears slide down his face. They were naked and unashamed. The seat next to him was empty. His wife, Claire, was still in the hospital after the accident that had taken their son. The doctor had told him that she would likely recover, but she might never walk again. They had told him this as though it were a spectacular consolation prize. Your son will never play in the majors or even see the Star Wars movie he was looking forward to, but you can rest assured that your now crippled wife will be home as soon as we're done milking your insurance for all it's worth. He sat there and accepted the pats, the condolences, the meaningless words that fell on him like daggers. His son was gone. These people were telling him how sorry they were for his loss. They didn't know loss. They were going to climb into their vehicle with mostly complete partners and go back to their homes so they could hug their own children and be glad it wasn't them who'd lost someone important. They would put the funeral announcements in a drawer by the door where they kept their keys or their change, and one day they would drag it out by mistake and think how sad it had been that such a youngster had died in the prime of his life. Then they would throw it away or put it in another drawer, and they would probably never think about it again. He seethed over these thoughts as he sat in the hard plastic chair provided by Copeland Funeral Home. He seethed over these people and their routine, unbroken lives until he was the only one there. Then John got up and he went home. John sat and watched TV, eating his TV dinner without much enthusiasm. The turkey was lumpy and had only cooked in the middle. The mashed potatoes were still half frozen, the gravy like liquid lava. On TV, the news anchor was talking about the Green Man murders. The latest victim, Shelley Rhodes, had been discovered in an alley. The police were looking for someone who might have seen the perpetrator. John watched apathetically as he spooned the mush into his mouth. A commercial came on for Anders Tires, and he tuned it out. Malcolm had been dead for 3 days, and John had done little but wallow in his misery. The house was like a monument to better times. He had stood in the entryway most of the afternoon after the funeral, staring at photos of him and Malcolm at the beach. Claire had taken it after they built that sandcastle they were both hunkered over. They had been at the shore for a week. Malcolm was as brown as a nut after spending 6 days on the beach. The castle had begun as a lopsided thing before John had gotten involved. Malcolm had bought the shoddy plastic molds at the beachside stand, and John had known a thing or two about sandcastle building. Together, they had constructed an elegant castle, complete with drawbridge and moat. The turrets had grown out of the sand, the flags had been leaves plucked from a nearby tree. Claire had been laughing as she snapped the photo, and the two of them had been grinning like fools over this accomplishment. John felt tears fall from his eyes, saw them tumble into his unappetizing mashed potatoes, and spooned them into his mouth anyway. Malcolm's room was the worst part of the house. The room stood at the very top of the staircase, easily viewable from the downstairs landing. John had stood in the dark last night and just looked at the doorway from the bottom step. The nightlight cast the scene in a strange shadowverse. He could vaguely see the baseball players trapped in their glory as they hung glossily from the wall by pushpins. He could see the bookshelf where John had taken his son's nightly bedtime story. He could see the balsa wood glider where it hung from the ceiling, the broken wing mocking him. How many times had John promised to fix it? How many times had he told Malcolm he would go buy a tube of airplane glue? How many times had he gone to the store and not done it? He He had thought he had time. He had thought he could do it some other when. He had been wrong. He had slept in his recliner every night after that. The phone rang then, dragging him from his misery. The picture on the screen was that of his wife, smiling like she was the happiest woman in the world as Malcolm grinned from her hugging arms. John felt a sob creep up his throat. He would have to change that. He answered it on the 6th ring, saying hello without much enthusiasm. "Hi, John." His wife sounded tired. She sounded like maybe she had been crying, too. She sounded like John felt, ready to just give up and join their son in his eternal rest. John found he didn't have much of a feeling about that. "Hi, Claire. You didn't come to see me today." He didn't have an answer for that, so he said nothing. "Are you okay, John? I'm worried about you." John thought about the question. He was not, he decided, okay, but if he told his wife this, she would worry. He hadn't come to see her today for that reason. Not for the reason that he suspected that she suspected, which was that he blamed her for his son's death. He no more blamed Claire than he blamed the car she had totaled when a semi-truck, driven by a man who was asleep at the wheel, had crushed their car against the guardrail. He didn't blame her for that. It was an event outside her control. He didn't come to see her because she would look at him and know that something was deeply wrong with him. She would see the dark circles, the pallid skin, the dirty face cleaned only by the tears that seemed to run tirelessly, and she would worry. He didn't care about any of that. Not really. But if she told a doctor about these things, John might spend the next few months as a drooling zombie while they pumped him full of dope. John did not want to dope his pain away. He wanted to wallow in it, like a pig wallows in filth. "John, are you mad at me?" He could hear the tears on the verge of bursting. "No, Kay, I'm just tired," he said, using her pet name. "I haven't slept well since..." His own tears slid out again, pale tracks of moisture that always seemed on the verge of falling. "Since the funeral. I wanted to be there for you, and for him, but I know," he lied. John knew very little that he was confident of these days. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay, John. I wish I were there to help you through this. I wish you were here to help me through this." She was crying now. He could almost hear her tears as they slid against the phone. He stared at the TV like a husk, incapable of feeling empathy for his sobbing wife. "I know, but someone has to pay the bills. Now more than ever." "That was a crock," said a voice in his brain. John had no more been to work than he had been upstairs. Mr. Beadle had given him bereavement, and he had taken it without a fight. He had done little more than sit morosely and fulfill his body's needs when they clawed against his consciousness. Feed the machine, empty the tank, sleep, rinse, repeat. It was all becoming very tedious. "You sound tired. I'll let you get to sleep. Will I see you tomorrow?" "Yeah," he said, lying again. "I'll swing by after work and see how you're doing." "I'd like that. I miss you, John. I love you." "I love you too, Kay." The lies came easily. He hung up the phone and continued to wallow. "Are you happy?" asked the man on the TV. He was a tall fellow, sleek black hair, thin mustache that looked oily. He was wearing a butcher's apron over a white shirt and smiling into the camera like he could see through John's TV. It was a little unsettling. John kept watching, figuring the commercial would be over soon. "Feeling empty? Perhaps seeking something you've lost?" John shoveled more food into his mouth, but felt his eyes locked on the greasy salesman. "Here at Bright Farm, we pride ourselves on helping those who are lost come back into the light. Whatever you're seeking, you can be sure that we have it here at Bright Farm. Our counselors are here 24/7 to..." John lifted the remote, a job that seemed harder than it should have, and flipped over to the next channel. Make sure the light does not escape you in your time of need. What in the hell? It was the same commercial. He clicked over again. Maybe you've recently had a crisis of faith, suffered an event that's made you question the existence of a bright and shining God. Maybe you've lost your way, no longer feeling that life is worth living. John had changed the channel 7 times while the man was talking, but found him on every channel. For some reason, the man was making him uncomfortable, and he wanted to see anything on the tube at that point. A baseball game, an old movie, a stupid sitcom, anything but this man and his smiling, stupid face. As he watched, the smile seemed to stretch under that mustache, and as he clicked the button to turn the set off, he realized that the man's eyes were fixed directly on him. The man was staring at him through the TV. The veins in his eyes seemed to be pulsating as John watched. Maybe you've even lost someone you loved. A mother. A brother. His eyes got very intense, and no matter how many times he hit the off button, the TV stayed on. A son. He was staring right at him now, and clearly only at him. He's here, John. He's here, and all you have to do is come to him. What are you waiting for, John? Why are you just sitting there, John? He misses you, John. The man was screaming from the TV. John was aware that his dinner was leaking into his sweatpants. He had upset the little plastic tray, but it hardly seemed to matter. The man on the TV was beating his fists against the glass front and yelling at John, questioning him, asking him why he didn't come to his son if he missed him so damn much. John was screaming as he did this, and he came awake all at once. The screen was snow, and he had indeed spilled his dinner. He turned off the television, cleaned up his chair, and thought longingly about going up to bed. It took him only a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs to return to his recliner. He slept fitfully that night. John woke up early the next morning, bright and early. This was something he seemed to be unable to shake from his old life. His job had expected him to arrive at 8 a.m. every day, and his brain seemed hardwired to wake up at 6 a.m. every morning. He thought about going to work. Maybe a day at the office would set him right. He could sit in his office and go over accounts and feel like his usual self. He could pretend that when 5 o'clock came around, he could go home to his loving wife and his best buddy in their 2-bedroom, 2-bath home. And when he got off and drove home, he would find it just that way. He only stood at the foot of the stairs for 20 minutes, seeing the pennants on the wall and watching the broken plane hanging suspended from the ceiling, before turning away and going to the kitchen instead. There would be no normal life for him. Never again. The round cereal clinked into the bowl cheerily. The box declared it was Space Acers, and it was Malcolm's favorite cereal. The marshmallows stood out amongst the grain circles. They were the kind of neon color that only a kid could love, the lumpy multicolor of poor craftsmanship and lack of real care. He saw a tear fall into them as he studied them. He remembered how Malcolm had sung the jingle every time he ate them. He remembered how Malcolm could name all 7 different marshmallow shapes, remembering when he'd gotten so excited over that Captain Acer's decoder ring that he'd found in the box last year. He saw another tear roll into the cereal and turned to get the milk. He opened the door and scanned the pristine white glow of the refrigerator for the carton. He was momentarily worried that it was out of date, but suddenly the happy cow face came into view. When he picked it up, he got a nasty shock as he realized that Bright Farm Dairy was printed over the head of the smiling cow. Had that always been his milk provider? He was sure it had been a different company last week. He turned the carton, reading the side description, feeling a kind of surreal haze roll over him. It told how Bright Farm cows were the happiest cows in the world. It told how Bright Farm was the leading provider of dairy for his area. Then he turned the carton and felt it slip out of his numb fingers. As it fell, he could clearly see the missing child picture side of the carton. The black and white photo made it hard to make out his exact features, but John would know the boy's sandy brown hair and green eyes, even in black and white. He was smiling, as he had been in the beach picture, and under the picture was the legend, "Found Child," answers to Malcolm, misses his father, wants to know why his father hasn't come to get him, wants to know why his father doesn't love him. The milk puddled on the ground as his son's face stared up at him from the floor. He felt the tears patter into the pool as he looked down at the spilled milk. "What do you mean you're out of milk?" John had been to 3 different stores, and each of them had been out of milk. The first 2 had had little signs taped over the milk coolers saying, sorry, they were out of milk. There had been no one to yell at there, but he had found someone to yell at when he reached the 3rd store. The man in the plastic apron bore it well, clearly not the first irate customer today, and flashed his pasted-on grin in the face of John's ire. "Sorry, sir, but the company had a little trouble with their trucks today. You could try another store, I suppose, but I'm guessing they're all in the same boat." Smug prick, John thought. He knew they were all in the same boat. "You could always go down to Bright Farm and get the milk yourself," the man added, taking a step away as though trying to distance himself from the conversation. John watched him go, breathing out disgustedly as he went back to the parking lot to find his car. He guessed he was going to Bright Farm. Bright Farm looked almost idyllic. John had driven for almost an hour, making his way out of the city's hustle and bustle and into the more rural areas surrounding the town. Here was the farm belt, the farms with acres of land, all planted with vegetables in neat rows, or with livestock happily munching grass in the field. John saw big red barns and farmhouses with long porches, people moving about between them as they went about their daily lives. The road ran on, and when his GPS said he had arrived, he almost didn't believe it. The farm had seemed like a strange place in the infomercial, some kind of farm akin to a backwoods gospel tent, where miracles happened, or at least they claimed they did. This place, though, looked like the farm in the Hidden Valley commercials. The road turned left onto a hard-packed dirt track. John could see fields ripe with produce, an orchard in the distance with happy pickers at work, a long pair of barns for cows or sheep maybe, and several tall wooden houses that looked almost Amish. The sign over the road said, "Bright Farm," in cheery white letters. The place seemed downright peaceful, downright wholesome. John turned his car down the road and drove towards the cluster of buildings. There were 8 two-story buildings of dark brown wood, with heavy windows that looked down from them. To John, they looked like disapproving eyes. Among them, as though surrounded, was a squat little building with a long porch complete with rockers. A sign hung across the roof declaring it to be the General Store. John thought it was as good a place as any for some information, so he mounted the steps and went inside. The bell tinkled overhead merrily. The inside was a packed but orderly arrangement of everything one might need for frontier life at the turn of the century. There were long shelves stacked with sacks of bean and corn, flour and sugar, bolts of cloth and spools of thread, and an overwhelming smell of brine that led him to a huge pickle jar near the front of the door. Behind a long counter stood a man in a butcher's apron, his dark hair and small mustache looking eerily familiar, wearing the biggest smile John had ever seen. He stared intently at John, and the attention made John's skin crawl. "Good morning, stranger. Are you here for the milk?" I guess so," John said. The man cocked his big smiling head and said, "Pardon me for saying so, sir, but you don't really seem too sure." I seem to be drawn here for some reason lately. I see your commercials and your products, and they seem to be calling me here." The man cocked his head to the other side, then snapped his fingers loudly. "I thought you looked familiar. You're John, right?" John jumped a little. How did you know my name?" "Oh, we've been waiting for you. We've been keeping something extraordinary for you. It's in the barn. Come on." The shopkeeper went off into the room behind the counter, beckoning John as he left. John felt drawn to follow him, but as he stepped, he contemplated. Was he really going to just follow the stranger into the back of his store? These people clearly wanted him here for some reason. Why give them what they wanted? Unless they might actually have. "Coming?" called a voice from the back. John was around the counter before he could stop himself. He followed the man into the back of the store, a shadowy mountain of creaking shelves. But to his surprise, the man in the apron was already standing by an open back door. He led him out into the bright dooryard and pointed to a long cowshed he had seen before. If he had thought it looked too big from the road, now it seemed to stretch off towards the field for far too long. It wasn't just the length either. The shed looked odd somehow. It looked like the kind of place that held secrets best left unfounded, like a freak show tent or the back room of a snake handler's revival. John hesitated as the man took a step towards the sheds, not wanting to know what lay inside. The man looked back cheerily. "Don't you want to see what we have for you? He's been waiting for so long." "Who?" John asked, but the man was already walking towards the shed, and John had to step quickly to catch up. The shed door creaked open ominously as the shopkeeper slid it to the side. He reached inside and fumbled against the wall with a loud snap, signaling the lights to life. They clicked on rapidly, lighting overhead fluorescence snapping on in a quick pattern that lit the small wooden berth in the long cowshed. As they stepped inside, the man walked briskly, and John tried to follow as his curious eyes also tried to take in what lay inside of each berth. Most were people, confused and naked as they sat in the straw, but some were full of objects or money or precious items. The worst was the shadowy stall that held things with red eyes and furtive breaths. They huddled in the darkness and looked at him as he went past. Their eyes held no recognizable emotion except hate. After a minute of quick walking, they came to a stop. The man extended his hand towards a closed stall. "This is it. Hurry up. He's waiting for you." John was a few steps behind him, the berth next to this one holding a smashed-up Mercedes. When he heard the man speak, his voice echoing in this strangely quiet place, John shivered a little. He didn't want to disturb the things here, many of which were rather disturbing on their own. John didn't want to know what might happen if they suddenly decided to leave their stalls and come out where they could get at him. As he came up to the gate of the berth in question, he could see a small, naked boy of about 10 sitting on the floor, his knees hugged up to his chest. A head of sandy blonde hair was visible between his knees, and John felt his breath stick in his chest. The hair was soft, baby fine, and looked recently washed. It sat artlessly on top of his small head, just as Malcolm's always had. John felt the tears slide down his face as he remembered how it had poked out underneath his baseball cap when he pulled it down to get it out of his face. Then the boy looked up with those 2 green eyes, and John saw Malcolm smile at him from the straw-strewn floor. "Daddy?" the boy asked, as though he didn't quite dare believe it. It was too much. John felt his knees unhinge, and suddenly he was falling into darkness as the naked boy rose from the floor and came to peek at him through the stall door. The last thing he saw before he blacked out were those 2 green eyes as they bored into him. He came awake with those eyes staring at him. Someone had put him in a bed. The sheets were soft and luxurious, but the blankets were like sandpaper as he lay atop them. The boy perched on his chest was digging into him painfully, and as he woke up, the boy smiled and crawled to snuggle under the blanket. He wrapped his small arms around him and noticed the uncomfortable fabric not at all. John felt the comfortable press of his son's as he lay beside him. How many days had he woken up just like this? Malcolm pressed between him and his wife as they slept together, his warm comfort against John's back as he warmed in between them. John wrapped his own arms around him and breathed in the scent of fabric softener, off-brand shampoo his wife bought for them, and the warm grass that always seemed to hang around his son. John opened his eyes. He expected to wake up in his own bed, the dream evaporating around him, but Malcolm was still there. The door opened then. The man from behind the counter walked in, his hard boots knocking on the wooden floor, and he smiled his too wide smile at John. "You're awake," he stated. John sat up and put a protective arm around his son. The boy was dressed in a pair of overalls, a blue shirt beneath, but John saw that he was still wearing the clothes he had arrived in. The room was Spartan, a bed and an end table being their only real elements, and as the smiling man towered over them, John began to feel self-conscious. He slid out of bed, Malcolm still clinging to him, and faced the man. "How is it that you came to have my son?" The man shrugged. "The farm knows what people want. It knows what people need. One day I was sweeping up, and he was just sitting there. He looked up with those big green eyes and asked where his daddy was, and I just knew that sooner or later you'd come looking for him." John ruffled the boy's hair. "I'm glad I did. It seems like everything lately was trying to bring me here." "Are you hungry?" the smiling man asked suddenly. "Margaret is just about to have lunch ready, and she'd be tickled pink if you'd join us." John looked down at Malcolm's 2 green eyes and smiled. "Sure, why not?" They spent the rest of the day together. After lunch, Thomas took them down to feed day-old bread to the ducks in the little pond. Thomas, the smiling man, had finally introduced himself. As he and his wife, a smiling plump woman of middle age, had fed them from their table, John couldn't take his eyes off of Malcolm. The boy dug into the meal just as his boy always had, like it might be the last one he ever had. And when Margaret offered him a piece of pie, the boy's eyes lit up with excitement. How many birthdays had John seen that same excitement cross his face as the cake came out? Malcolm caught John staring at him and smiled shyly as Margaret added a big scoop of ice cream to go with it. After the ducks, Malcolm noticed a playground in the town commons. He dragged John to a small clearing with wooden climbing courses and metal antiques that spun and bobbled. As John sat and watched, other kids came over to play with Malcolm in that effortless way that children often do. Watching Malcolm play, running during tag or jumping or loping during their make-believe games, filled John with a curious mixture of hope and dread. He hoped this would never end. He hoped he had crashed his car on the way to the farm and this was heaven, and that he could simply sit here and watch his boy play for the rest of his days. At the same time, he dreaded when this would have to end, and his sadness would creep back as the delusion or dream or whatever it was finally ended. "It's best not to think too hard about that, John." John jumped. Thomas had seated himself next to him, the stretched skin on his mouth still fashioned in that rictus of a smile that up close seemed almost painful. Why did he smile like that if the act hurt him? He tried to find his words, but they all seemed to muddy in his mind in the face of that bitter smile. To think about what? How he can be, or how he came to be here. He is here. He's your son, and it's best not to think about it. John watched him as though he might vanish if he looked away. "We can make a place for you here," Thomas continued. "A place for you and Malcolm. You can be part of this community and know the blessing of the bright, as we all do." John snapped his gaze back to Thomas. "I'm sorry, what are you talking about?" Thomas put his old worn hands on his knees and grinned. "Well, you're here now. We have to find the two of you a place in our community." "Why would I do that?" John asked, genuinely perplexed. "Well, you can't leave. The two of you have to stay." John felt himself growing angry, but tried to keep it in check. This man had given him an irreplaceable gift, and it wouldn't be good manners to shout at him. Are you trying to tell me that we can't leave?" Thomas shrugged. "Of course not. You're free to leave at any time. But Malcolm, he is of the bright. You can't take him away from here. It would be cruel to do so." Malcolm ran up about that time, his face flushed with excitement. "Daddy, some of the kids want to know if we'll attend service with them this evening. Can we go? It sounds like fun." John collected Malcolm into his arms then and stood towering over the smiling Thomas. "No, son. I think it's time we left. Your mother will never believe it when I show you to her." But just the thought of sharing Malcolm made John feel strange. Thomas seemed unperturbed by John. "I wouldn't do that, friend. It never ends well. Just leave us alone. All of you, just leave us alone," John said, backing away. He was running by the time he made it to the parking lot. Malcolm's familiar weight carried effortlessly. John's car was conspicuously absent. He had thought it was some kind of illusion. The tan-colored car would appear when he got a little closer. But now, he saw that even the ruts he had left in the dirt were gone. The car was missing. He was left with few options for escape. He turned towards the road and saw the quaint wooden gate rising in the distance. It could have been 50 feet. It could have been 50 miles. John didn't care. As the sun set at his back, He began to walk towards the gate. "Daddy, don't. I feel sick," Malcolm whined. John ignored him, clinging to him as he jogged for the gate. He could flag down a car once they made it to the road. After all, this was a busy road, and a passing trucker or traveler would take them back to the city. They could be home by bedtime. Malcolm could sleep in his own bed, beneath the watchful eye of his baseball posters and his Star Wars ships that hung from the ceiling by fishing line. "Daddy!" Malcolm's voice sounded hoarse. The dirt puffed under his feet as he jogged. With every step, he expected a torch-bearing mob to rise up to block their path. They wouldn't want him to take this miracle child from them, something that should not exist, and they would fight to stop him from leaving. He would fight them. They would kill him, but he would fight them. He would die, but his last image would be of Malcolm as he, "Stop it! I feel sick, Daddy! I don't want to leave! I want to! I want to!" Malcolm became dead weight in his arms as he jogged. The stile came up before him, and he hefted the child into his arms as he ran. Malcolm was heavy, his skin clammy. Something like sweat or tears dampened John's shirt as he ran. He was suddenly fearful. What if they had poisoned him? What if they had done something to Malcolm so he couldn't leave? He finally looked down at his precious son and screamed into what had once been Malcolm's face. John found he was holding something akin to a lump of clay in his arms, just like a child's approximation of a person. The arms were thick and lumpy, the body little more than a badly formed torso of androgynous humps. The head was malformed, its eyes and mouth little more than scooped out holes with tufts of hair shoved hastily into the muck. When it turned its face to him and spoke, Malcolm rasped out garbled words full of pain and confusion. John felt that he must surely be going mad. He fell to his knees, the gates within arm's reach, and wept into the bulbous chest of Malcolm's newly formed body. This was unbearable. To lose his son again, and in such a way as this, was unthinkable. He couldn't recover from this. If this was really some dream, then this would be the part where he would wake up screaming into his pillow. Things like this didn't happen under the eyes of a loving God. There was only so much pain a man could take before he broke completely. He knelt in the dirt and sobbed into the mushy chest of his twice-lost son, praying for insanity, praying for an end to understanding. It was dark when Thomas found them. John didn't shudder or even acknowledge him when he put a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to him, and in the moonlight, his smile looked ghoulish. "Why?" John croaked, his face awash with the muddy flesh of his still croaking boy. "Why?" Thomas only shook his head, grinning. "I tried to tell you, friend. The gifts of Bright Farm are only for those who accept the bright. The miracles experienced here are not for the outside world. If you want to stay with Malcolm, then you must stay near the bright." John turned back to the odd boy thing. He stared at it for a long time. "If I accept this bright, my son will be returned to me?" "As he was before," Thomas assured. John looked away, and in the moonlight, his martyr's mask was ghastly with the mush of his son's chest. "Show me." Thomas took him by the hand. He led John towards the chapel that lay beyond the cowshed. Inside, a sun seemed to shine only for those within. As they approached, John could feel it baking him and felt the warmth fill him. He felt his fear, his anger, his sadness, and all his doubt burned from him. Someone by the wooden door took the boy shape from him, and at that moment he barely noticed. He had discovered something new, something old. As the doors were opened and the baking bright shone over him, he felt his lips pulled into a painful smile. The bright was all he ever needed, the thing he wanted but never knew. He was burned anew by the bright, and it was good. The van pulled up in the dirt parking lot of the little community. The ramp came down, and the sandy-haired woman rolled her wheelchair onto the metal slab. As it descended, She began looking at the gawking faces that had gathered to see her descent. She had used a wheelchair since the accident, but she refused to let it stop her. Even if she had to crawl, she wouldn't have allowed it to stop her from finding John. For 6 months, she'd recovered in the hospital alone. For 6 months, he had ignored her phone calls. When the bank had called to let her know that her mortgage hadn't been paid in 6 months, she was worried. When the police called her to tell her her husband's car had been found abandoned on the stretch of road leading up to this place, she was terrified. When her friend Lisa had seen him at the farmer's market, selling quilts and homegrown vegetables, she was furious. He had abandoned their old life to find himself in the country, it seemed, leaving her in the ICU to fight for her life and worry about him as he slid into silence. She meant to find him and make him answer for his absence. The wheels of the chair didn't much care for the dirt path that led up to the 2-story houses that seemed to be the living quarters of this little community. The man on the phone had told her that John lived in the house closest to the playground, and as she rolled towards that playground, she felt her arms grow stiff and non-compliant. She sat in the dirt road and gawked at the perfect, sandy-haired boy that was now standing atop the play structure and laughing with the other overall-clad children. Malcolm. It was Malcolm. He looked at her then, and she saw recognition dawn on his face. He jumped from the structure, landing in that way that seems the providence of only children and drunks, and ran to her with guileless joy. He buried his face against her chest, rubbing his soft hair against her, and fixed her with those deep green eyes that had enchanted her since birth. It was him, in the flesh, and as he hugged her, she could no more summon the strength to hug him back than she could have summoned the strength to strangle him to death. "Mommy! Mommy! I missed you!" She saw a man rise from the bench, and through his tangled beard she could see it was John. He was smiling, his face a rictus of pleasured pain. His mouth smiled, but as she saw his eyes, she felt a stab of pain rip through her heart. His eyes were pinched, screaming, and as he approached, he seemed to be begging her to run. He bent to hug her, melding against his son easily as the two embraced her like some lost relation who had come back again. How is this possible, John? He smiled at her with that painful grin. "Come to the barn, Claire. All things can be found if you're willing to see the light." Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. I see I've got quite a few new subscribers. I'd just like to stop and say thank you and welcome. I hope you like what you hear so far. Time to once again to thank our patrons. Thanks in part to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to become one of our contributors, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can have your name read out at the end of every video and every TikTok that I make. Or, of course, you could always just come back next week. I love to see returning faces for a good story. Until then, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.